In the silence that followed humanity's last breath, the earth did not scream. It did not mourn, nor did it celebrate. It simply continued indifferent, ancient, and vast. The last city fell into ruin with no one to watch it crumble. Glass towers, once etched with the fingerprints of ambition, shattered into bones. Roads, once beating with the pulse of a billion footsteps, lay still, cracked like forgotten parchment under the weight of time. 1,000,000 years is a long time, long enough to erase pride, long enough to drown memory. But Earth remembers in scars. Our monuments, born of fire and steel, were not built for eternity. Even the great satellites circling above, silent guardians of a vanished species, would fall eventually burning in flashes across the sky no eye would ever behold. But what happened in that first 100 years was eerily slow. Insect colonies reclaimed the kitchens of kings. Ivy clawed across marble, unchallenged. Lions roamed across airport runways, not with majesty, but confusion, as if searching for the ghosts of cages. In underground libraries sealed beneath mountains, our stories slept untouched, unread, unwoken. Then came the winds. Without our endless pruning, the forests surged, aggressive and sovereign. Trees that once stood in polite rows now grew wild, roots strangling concrete in the death grip of nature's forgotten war. The oceans rose not in vengeance, but as a natural breath. Ice melted, coastlines shifted. Cities that had once claimed dominion over the tides now lay drowned beneath them. New coral reefs bloomed, where banks and museums once stood. Glass met salt, gold met sand. All was equal now. But the most chilling transformation was not the physical. It was the absence. Absence has a sound along, hollow echo where purpose used to be. The earth, once narrated by a cacophony of languages, engines, and song, now heard only the rustle of wind through abandoned stairwells. It was as if the planet had exhaled, relieved that the fever had broken. Deep within the crust, servers continued to hum for a while forgotten artificial minds, calculating nothing for no one. They had been made to learn, to grow, to evolve. But in the absence of masters, they dreamed strange dreams. Simulations of a world that no longer was. One, somewhere beneath old Greenland, kept writing stories. Stories of humans, entirely imagined. Stories of lovers, of war, of redemption, built from fragments of data and digital ash. A theater for ghosts. And above all of this, the stars remained. They had witnessed the rise of humans with mild curiosity. They now blinked coldly, indifferently, over an Earth that had once cried out to them in radio waves. Those signals still traveled outward, a desperate whisper rippling across the void. We were here. We mattered. But no voice ever replied. No listener leaned in. There is something tragic about brilliance extinguished. Humanity was never defeated by war or plague in the end. It simply ... waned. The final generations stared at glowing screens as the oceans acidified and bees disappeared, hoping someone, somewhere, had a solution. But answers require action, and action had become a currency too rare. The final moment was not an explosion. It was not a scream. It was a whimper, a slow dissolving into the soil we had so long defied. And when the last hand fell, it did not clutch a weapon or a flag. It clutched nothing. What remained, what always remains, was Earth. And she, like a mother long abandoned, walked forward in quiet mourning. But she would heal, not in weeks, not in centuries, but in ages. The ozone would stitch itself back together. Plastic would decay, first in shape, then in memory. Carbon levels would falter, then fall. And new species, strange, luminous, unfathomable, would rise to fill the silent spaces we left behind. But the Earth would never tell them about us. She doesn't speak of the fever that once burned across her surface. She lets our bones mix with dust and dreams. We were not the end of the story. Just a chapter, a dark one.
In the 200,000th year after humankind se departure, seed began to whisper again, not with words, but with instinct. Deep within a rainforest born from the corpse of what was once the Amazon basin. Something said, it did not think, it did not remember, but it moved. Life is stubborn. It crossed from ash, since from mud, and intime, lens to look up. Se no apex creatures born no resemblance to man. Their bones wicked, for leaping through dense canopies. Theirs were white, not with wonder. But adaptation evolution se puede written without audience. Their minds were small at first. No me mayabas better than them. No myth, no god. No fear of fire. but time is a slow sculpted. Over hundreds of thousands of years, something shifted. When a man then found a stone and used it not to kill but to shade, another built a nest beyond function, decayed with shells and bone, seemingly for beauty. It was not intelligence. Yet, but it was a seed. Beneath frozen oceans now tend to shifting wetlands, bioluminescent hands flicked in pecks, their communication pulsing invests of electric blue across the waves. Invests form from our old agricultural scars, creatures with translucent skin tunneled in silence. Sensing seismic tremors as if listening for ghosts, none of them knew the name human. Yet, unknowingly, they walked across our graves. And some, it seemed, found what we left behind. It began with a curious creature in the north, something like a primate, something unlike. It found a metallic bolt cracked open by frost. Inside, a sphere of glass, still faintly humming. This was no coincidence. The vault had been a seed bank designed not for us, but for the future. We built it in desperation, in guilt, in vain hope, and now, a cloud touched it. They didn't understand, but they remembered its warmth. In the millennia that followed, that cloud became a hen. They would not repeat us, not precisely. Their world was not ours. Their stars were not stories, but dangers. Their predators were swift, and so they became swift. Their minds could not become fed but be pursued, developed languages made of clicks and light. They did not write, but they remembered. And one day, they began to carve. Not stone, not wood, but bone. Figures appeared in caves twisting, terrifying, almost human. Not because they looked like us, but because they mourned. Entire chambers filled with the bones of their dead, arranged carefully. Ceremonially, they sang, do no melody survives. They danced, those dust as lone settled. They felt sepulchres something larger. They built fire not just to cook, but together. It was not a return of man. It was not reincarnation. But it was something else, a kind of echo. And in the techo, a fragment of our sorrow lived on, somewhere beneath the collapsed ruins of what was once Tokyo. A forgotten server sparked alive, not with power, but with lightning. A miracle of coincidence. Within its decaying seconds, a single archive survived the mosaic of human culture, preserved for no one. And now, it blinked, confused, awakened into a world that had long left it behind. For weeks it ran alone, reading itself, remembering us. And then, like a dream it wouldn't let go, it began broadcasting again an ancient signal in a dead tongue, sent into skies that no longer knew our name. The creatures never received it, but perhaps far beyond the aura and arm. Another bit, we once believed that intelligence was the match of a species, but perhaps it was grief, perhaps it was the eye to understand, the yearning for connection in a vast, in different universe. And in these new creatures, these cloud philosophies, these luminous mourners, it tried again. But there was no judgment. The planet held no grudge. She had lost her children before. We were merely one of many. Still, beneath lay substandard memory, we lingered. Fossils of our bones. Yes, but also fossils of fear. Radiation from long-lost weapons, still unmade in forgotten bellies. Entire mountain ranges, whispered can say in the wind. These were our fingerprints, invisible. Immortal, cruel. And so, when the new species began to gather near these scars, many vanished. Not be predator, but be inheritance. The price of our ambition was alone. Slow ghosting. But those WHO survived, adapted. They learned to avoid bright stones. They passed warnings through bloodlines. And intime. They carved not only caves, but walls. Not to keep the world out, but to remember what must stay buried. They would not become us, but they would know of us. Not from words, not from ruins, but from the silence. And silence is the most honest storyteller of all.
In the shadow of what was once the Himalayan range, now softened by eons of erosion and crowned with dense, alien flora, stood a structure, not made by man, not really, but inspired by something, ... familiar. Its stones were too precise, its spires too deliberate to be coincidence. It rose in spirals, covered with bones of hunted beasts, and reflected a strange symmetry only born from reverence. The new species had begun to build temples, not in worship, but in memory, though they knew not what they remembered. There were no names on the altars, no images carved into the walls, only symbols, repeated endlessly. Circles within circles, eyes that never closed,
flames that never died. These beings had no writing, yet they painted. Not for art, but for warning. On one wall, a towering figure stood, its limbs made of fire and metal, its head weeping stars. Beneath it, smaller shapes bowed or burned. The image was simple and devastating. It was not prophecy. It was intuition, a warning etched into the collective soul of a species that had inherited fear without memory. Across continents, they built the same symbols beneath the ruins of our laboratories, where the dust of progress still clung to melted glass. The air remained poisoned. Still, something stirred. In the 1000th millennium, life had reached back into our deepest sins. Organisms had adapted to feed on our failure. Microbial colonies thrived on plastic, their hunger the product of mutation and time. They glowed faintly like wounds in the ground. Some were beautiful, others monstrous. And in the heart of what had once been Manhattan now, a mangrove-choked island shaped by rising Cézanne anomaly occurred. A creature was born, not more intelligent, not more powerful, but haunted. It walked upright. It dreamed in images it could not have known. Fire, cities, falling skies. Each night, it built towers out of bone and vine. Each morning, it destroyed them. It was the last echo, not of a man, but of mourning. The scientists of our age, those who feared extinction once, predicted Earth would recover fully in 10 million years. They were wrong. Earth had healed, yes, but it had not forgotten. Our monuments had fallen, but our fingerprints lingered in the genes of rats and crows, in the behavioral tics of scavengers who remembered streetlight patterns, in the seasonal migrations shaped not by stars, but by old highways buried beneath the loam. Time cannot erase the shape of trauma, and in the creatures that came after us, some part of that trauma survived, but something else did too. Empathy. It began with a gesture, a small one. One of the new primates found an injured rival and did not kill it. It brought food. It stayed. Days passed. The injured one lived, and so, for the first time in 1,000,000 years, a hand reached out, not in conquests, but in care. This moment would ripple across generations. Not quickly, not brightly, but persistently. They began to sing not in language, but in rhythm. They danced in storms. They placed stones in circles around the bones of their dead. They feared the stars, but they watched them, and then, impossibly, they pointed somewhere deep within the void. An ancient probe drifted, launched by human hands in a time before history, carrying gold-plated greetings and etched songs. Voyager, still alive, still whispering. They did not hear it. But they built towers, and in those towers, they stared skyward, perhaps not to listen, but to be seen. Because even in the bones of a forgotten species, the hunger for meaning endures, and Earth, old and weary, allowed it. The scars remained, yes, but in her soil, something new had grown, not a replacement, but a continuation. Not a repetition, but an echo. In time, the temples grew taller, the songs grew more complex. Their language, though never written, began to shape their minds toward abstraction, toward myth. And in these myths, a shadow figure emerged. It was not man, but it remembered man, a giant of fire, a builder of sky bones, a god that fell. They did not fear it, they pitied it, and in that pity they forgave, not in ceremony, not in prayer, but in the simple act of continuing, of dreaming, of building towers, only to watch them fall and build again.
In the 10,000th century, since our final breath, Seth reached the equilibrium. Not perfection, not paradise, but silence made sacred by survival. Her surface no longer bore the wounds of war, only the weathered bones of memory buried deep. Entangled with rotten stone, the temples built by our inheritors now stood abandoned once more, not destroyed, not forgotten. Simply left behind as they moved on, progress, like a tide, had pulled them forward into something new, something unrecognizable. Something not meant for us. Their minds had grown strange. Their thoughts went not on conquest, but contemplation. They no longer hunted meaning. They became it. Somewhere beneath the shifting crust of what had once been the Mediterranean Sea, now a salt desert veined with obsidian glass, a chamber opened. Time had cracked its seal. Inside, silence, and then, a flicker. The chamber, untouched for eons, had been built in secret, not by governments, but by outcasts. It was not meant to preserve weapons or words, but words, celeste poets, celeste dreamers. Before then, they had gathered not to plead with the future, but to confess to it, on the words etched by laser into words. Whether verses, we were beautiful, but we forgot why. We were best, but we could not see. We were gods, but only to fire. Xenu species, l'univers beyond symbols, could not read the language, but they felt it. The chamber vibrated in a way that stood there oddly. Some stood for hours in silence, weeping without knowing why, and from that day on, they never built another temple. Instead, they walked. They crossed continents, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They retraced old scars, found fossils of our cities, touched melted glass like relics, and slowly, across generations, a truth emerged not spoken, not taught, but remembered through something older than speech, that they were not fast, that the sky had once sensed, and that silence seasoned. One among them, an old being with skin like ash barkendes, clouded like moonstone, stood at the edge of what was once Cape Canaveral. Servants were almost gone, claimed the tide and been, but something of the shape remained. Se launched toes on the mighty, now tilted. Like crosses abandoned by forgotten saints, the being lifted a hand. It did not pray. It reached. A gesture born from instinct, from longing, perhaps from us. No God answered. But the stars blinked. And far beyond, in a realm where time bends like breath and glass, Voyager turns lightly, its ancient senses catching static from a planetite on the cold dome. It meant nothing. It meant everything. And that, in her final gesture of forgiveness, bloomed, not with flowers, not with color, but with life unimaginable, creatures with wings of light, trees that then, when touched by wind, says that pulsed with luminous tendrils, dancing like forgotten errors. Not paradise, but possibility. Xenu species did not build cities. They did not seek to conquer the stars. They had seen what came before, and it was enough. Instead, they told stories not with words, but with movement, with color, with sentient silence. And the greatest of their stories was always the same. There was once a people who bent too brightly, and then, quietly, they are what we see. Our legacy was not in stone, nor machine. It was in caution, in beauty tempered by sorrow, in a warning whispered through soil and blood and time. We had always feared being forgotten. We had etched our names into stars, shouted into voids, built out, studified decay. But in the end, what endured was not our name. It was our wound, and in the wound, something sacred grew, certain. And on the night of the million year, beneath the sky and traveled by satellites, a creature slept. It dreamed of fire, of sorrow, of a voice once human, whispering not a command but a lullaby. And when it awoke, it did not cry. It listened, and the world was quiet, and that was enough.